Okay, recording in progress. That's good. Thank you. Yeah, and basically, here we go. So, as Barthel said, diversity in academic language and learning, the future may not be what it used to be. The title I've chosen, not the diversity part of it, because that's the theme of the conference, but the title I've chosen is because I want to give a little bit of an overview first before I talk about the future. An overview of where we're at, who we are, what we're doing, and so on. And as a good colleague and friend of mine, Kate Shannock, once said to me, he tells us who we are. Okay, well, that's one of the things I want to do. Now, how do I get rid of the pictures here? I don't want to see myself. I don't need to see myself. Okay, let's move it over. Okay, right. So, a quick overview first of what I'm going to talk about. I will talk about the academic language and learning educators, who we are, where we are, how many of us are here compared to the past. Then I'll talk about the diversity of the students we service or supposed to service. I'll talk also about the services themselves, what we do, what we used to do, what we're doing at the moment, how well that works to some extent. I'll talk about the diversity of policies or lack thereof and quality standards. And then I will talk about future challenges, of course, and they're numerous. I will only touch on some of them. So overall, I don't think I'm going to need the whole 40 minutes allocated to this keynote, because I'd like to leave time, more time than usual, for questions, for discussion, because I may raise issues here that need a bit further exploring. Okay, so let me start with the AALL educators, the numbers there. You may wonder throughout my presentation where I got all this information from that I will talk about, all this data, these numbers, and so on and so on. Let me take you back to 1993, where I was when I was working at UTS, and I started actually, I was interested to get to set up networks of people doing similar work at other universities. And I started what then became, over the years, the table of Australian academic language and learning units and centers across the center, which I updated every year to give people an idea of how many people were working at each university, what they were doing, all staff to student ratios, student numbers, enrollments, number of international students, and so on. And I continued to do that until I retired, or a little bit afterwards. And then recently, Sally Ashton-Hay and Amanda Miller and myself, we kind of did a project to revive this table, which is what I'm going to base the current data on. Amanda and Sally and I will give a paper this afternoon about that. Okay, so that's as an introduction to where I got most of the information from. The second point about that introduction is that in my last update of the table, I also asked people in various universities to name 3 main issues that they were facing at the moment, and we'll talk about, so that will explain how I got some of the issues, some of the challenges that I will talk about later. Now, interestingly, most people replied to that, but very few people sent me their 3 issues, their 3 main issues, meaning they send me heaps more. They're faced with so many issues, it is actually quite scary at times. All right, a few diverse numbers to start off with. Staff numbers. Back in 2010, there were approximately 460 academic language and learning staff across the country. Nowadays, and I'm saying nowadays because even though I said 2021 here, some of the data is 2020 and even 2019, and I use the most updated data I could find for consistency purposes. Okay, so approximately at the moment we have 380 academic staff across the country. So that's a drop of 17% compared to about 10 years ago, which some of you may think that is not very much, many fewer, but let me explain why I think it is considerably fewer. Now, back in 2010, about 52% of academic language learning staff had the academic status versus the general or professional staff status. Now that's gone down to 18%. So that's a drop of 71%. Now, is that a bad thing? Yes and no. I'm not suggesting that that all staff with academic status do a better job, not at all. But what is happening here is the universities are saving considerable amount of money by employing general staff or professional staff, as they call at the HEW level 5, 6, 7, or 8. And the big drawback, the big consequence of that is that a lot of these general professional staff can't do, or in some cases are not allowed to do research, and that's an issue. If we want to move on to what we're trying to do, we need to be able to do research to inform our practices. Okay. Student numbers. Back in 2010, there were about 1.12 million students across the higher university sector. These days, it's 1.5 million, so plus 33% more than we had before. Now compare that to the minus 17% that I talked about above in terms of staff numbers. Overseas students or international students back in 2010, 280,000, representing 25% of the student population. Nowadays, it's 450,000, about 30% of the student population. Now, that is an increase of 60% over 10 years. That is enormous, okay? So if you compare that alone to the minus 17% of all staff numbers, that is a little bit scary again. Now, one of the interesting figures I used to do, and I still use, is the academic language staff to student ratio. Back in 2010, it was 1 to 2,400 students. That has dropped to 1 to 3,900. Now, that is very serious. Now, you may very well ask, what does that mean? It's a little bit like saying, how many GPs are there in the countries? In some parts of the country, it's 1 to 500 people. In some other parts of the country, it's 1 to 2,000 or 20,000 people in population. I don't have a perfect number. I don't have the perfect number, but that is a considerable shift. Since back in 2010, I already felt that we were not servicing students sufficiently well in terms of the quantity of staff we had to do that. You can imagine what I would say now. Now, not only is that bad, but look at the range. Back in 2010, the range was from 1 to 700 to 1 to 7,300 in some universities. That range is now from 1 to 375 at the University of Divinity, which has a very small student population, which explains this staff to student ratio, to the University of Wollongong, where it's 1 to 15,900. That was one of the universities that has one of the largest center of academic learning and stuff in the country. No, not anymore. All right, I hope this is not too depressing so far. The other diversity that we have in our field in terms of where we are is where we are located. Now look at here. Back in 2010, 79% approximately of staff were located in central units, central academic language and learning units of various names, the study center, the language center. My university was called the ELSA Center, and so on and so on. Now we're kind of spread a little bit all over the place, with 43% in gone to student services, in centralized units, 23%, selected faculties, 19%. And I'm saying selected because in some universities where AALL staff are in faculties, not every faculty has one or several staff, and some of us are in libraries. The diversity in managers of all staff has also changed considerably. In 2010, about 87%, that's by far almost all of them, of AALL managers had an AALL background. which was very useful because they understood then the work that we were doing, were able to promote it and be champions for us when they were to talk to staff above them, senior staff at the university. Today, our managers are more diverse, some with no or limited language education backgrounds. And that was something that I realized when I was doing the survey that I mentioned earlier on. When I talked to people, when I rang people and contacted them and said, you know, can you give me the data of the staff that you have at the moment? They basically said, who are you? What are you doing? What is AALL? What does it stand for? I'm not a member of the association. I can't give you this data, and so on and so on. In other words, at that level already, there was limited understanding of what it is we do. Now, diversity of students. I'll start off with a profile. Relke mentioned before the kind of students that Charles Darwin University has. I will confirm that because several years ago, I was invited to work on a project at CDU at Charles Darwin University. And in talking to a number of people at the beginning of the project, I said, what kind of students do you have at the university here? I mean, being well aware that at that time, international students were not a large percentage of the students. What the university want to find out is how can we improve retention rates of students? So the person I spoke to said to me, here is the typical profile of the students we have at Charles Darwin University. It's a mature age, single mother, living with her 3 school-age boys in rural South Australia with no undergraduate degree, enrolled in a distance education postgraduate course at CDU. And she's competing with her sons to access their 10-year-old computer. So can you imagine how you could reach this person if you want to help them with the kind of services that we provide through academic language and learning, okay? The person I was speaking to at the time said, now these students, most of the time don't last the distance. They drop out after 1 semester or 2 semesters, realizing that they can't complete their studies. We also see, of course, in most universities, we see undergraduate students, postgraduate students, HDR, distance education, offshore students, international students. Now, let me pause here for a second and talk a little bit about international students. Now, while universities advertise reasonable, I've questioned the word reasonable here, language entry requirements for international students with an IELTS hopefully equal or above IELTS 6. And the IELTS people themselves actually advocate an IELTS of a minimum IELTS of 6.5. Now, that would not be too bad, but the majority of international students, they enter universities via pathway courses or pathway institution, which with a considerably lower language entry requirement, sometimes lower than IELTS 5. Now, IELTS 5, a student at IELTS 5 would have difficulty reading a simple newspaper, okay? Put that in context. We service mature age students. Now, at the postgraduate level, some have limited or no previous university experience and completed their undergraduate degree a long time ago. But the employer, for example, in nursing, in a whole range of professions, now in order to move on or up or around in their employment field, they need to have a postgraduate qualification. This is a serious problem. We service indigenous students, and tomorrow, at the keynote tomorrow, Professor Martin Nakata will talk about that specifically. We service domestic English-speaking background and language and other than English students, many, surprisingly, many with far lower English language proficiency levels than international students. So overall, we face a number of challenges here. We've realized over time that most first-year students are generally unprepared for university study. many of whom have serious language issues. It's estimated that from feedback, this anecdotal feedback I've got from universities, is estimated that the students who are challenged from a language point of view is about a third of all first-year students. The number of students, another challenge is the number of students increases, but also their diversity. While, as we saw in the previous slide, the number of all educators has decreased. Now that in itself is a considerable challenge. So I will conclude that slide by saying, as universities have become more inclusive over the years, which is great, they have become less equitable towards their students. Our services have become increasingly diverse as well. Now, first I'll start with these standard services, what everybody's accustomed to, all support workshops, the generic workshops, essay writing, report writing, seminar presentation 101, seminar presentation 102, and so on, so on. One-to-one consultations, which are gradually being phased out at many universities, unfortunately, because universities realize it's a very expensive type of provision of service. Embedding academic language and learning into the curriculum has become more and more common. I've put embedding into quotation marks because embedding means very, very different things to different people at different institutions. Ranging from, oh, I'm talking on a regular basis with people in faculties, therefore I'm embedded in these faculties. That's one example I got. To fully embedded academic language and learning into curriculum where students have to attend units, compulsory units where academic language and learning is embedded, and so on and so on. So that's the spectrum, the scale of what embedding means at various places. Orientation programs is something we've been running for a long time too, teaching credit units, and so on. Now, we also have been asked to provide additional services, and by additional, you should read services that in fact are more work for us. That's in addition to what we are offering in what I call the standard services. We've been required increasingly to teach ESL type classes for low English language proficiency students. Now, many of us are not qualified or not experienced, so don't have the competence to teach ESL, so that's a challenge. We've been asked by many universities without much experience in many cases to organize post-enrollment language assessment. Now, I've got nothing against that. On contrary, I was one of the early people that kind of promoted PILA at universities. But if you don't have experience in knowing what you're doing, you know, it can become quite a nightmare. Developing and providing online resources. Now, that's something that's more in the context of the last 2 years of the COVID pandemic. Organizing chats, forum, proofreading. Again, here, many of us did not have the kind of experience to do that, the technical know-how and so on. So we learned very, very quickly overnight how to handle that. And that's an amazing achievement, but it also has resulted in many places of staff burnout. I can't cope, I can't do this, this is too much, and so on, as Relke indicated in her introduction. Providing support to students with mental health issues, and that's a new one. That is something that was raised in many of the issues that were reported to me about a month ago by people who, as part of their list of the 3 issues that they were facing. And I don't know how people have coped with that. Offering staff development to faculty staff. Again, all of a sudden somebody said, you know, out of the blue, senior management kind of came to talk to us and said, you know, we'd like you to talk to staff in faculties, how you're doing with the work that you're doing. And while you're there, can you please train them to do the kind of work that you're doing, academic language and learning people, so they can take over and do it themselves. So challenges here. And something that's also popped up in the list of issues that I mentioned earlier is fixing studiosity. the number of people who commented on, they've submitted their essay to, students have submitted their essay to studiosity, it came back, they thought it was fixed, they submitted it, they failed, so we looked at the essay, and in fact, it had not been fixed at all. So here is a new issue also. Okay. The challenges. Let me talk about the challenges. So I'm looking at papers here. First, I'll talk about challenges at the institutional levels. They're quite diverse too. The first one is restructures. Restructures, restructures, and restructures. Nearly every university in Australia has restructured its academic language and learning services in the past 5 years. Some universities have done that more than once. And in fact, as a result of the restructure at many places, the academic and learning staff were the first to be restructured negatively, as some universities, as some employers say, where staff had been, inverted commas, managed out. Okay, consequences: loss of staff, forced redundancies, change of status and or employment conditions from tenure to contracts to part-time work, morale issues, considerable morale issues. The number of people I have come across who have said, when I've said, is Jenny still working with you? Is Peter still working with you? Oh, no, they left about a year ago. They couldn't take it anymore, whatever. Increased casualization. So now universities are relying more frequently on casual staff, as well as on studiosity and services like that. Increased workloads, isolation of all staff. We have disbanded the Academic and Learning Center. We're going to put 2 of you in the Faculty of Business. 1 of you will go in the Faculty of Engineering, and the 3rd one, well, I hope you take redundancy package. Okay, so that's isolating. Those staff don't have the opportunity to talk to each other as well as they did before that. And the other challenges: funding cuts, introduction of commercial providers of all. Okay, universities think they're saving money by using commercial providers of our services. Challenges such as COVID-related issues, offshore international students, online teaching. I mentioned that before. How many of us were trained to do that or prepared to do that? And of course, increasingly a limited recognition of the pedagogic and financial value of our work in many universities. And that's related to what I mentioned before. Our managers are not our champions anymore. Our managers are, I've got nothing against librarians, but if they are librarian, they may have their own library staff to look after when they go and talk to senior management, and then they forget talking about the work that we do. The financial value of our work. Let me tell you a little anecdote of something that happened to me when I was still working at my university. I was faced one day with justifying to what was called a financial committee at my university to explain to them what we were doing at my at the center where I was director, and I was asked the question: what is the value added component of the work that you do? And I kind of thought for a second, what does that mean? And then I kind of looked at the person who asked the question and said, do you mean what you get for the buck that you give us? I said, yes, something like that. And I said, okay, well, let me put it that way. Last year, we saw about 5,000 students at the university who came to us for various services. Some of them we saw in faculty, some of them came to the center, and some attended workshops and individual assistants and so on and so on. Now, if 10% of these 5,000 students, in other words, if 500 of these students managed as a result of our intervention to make it through their university studies and provide funding to the universities, that money equivalent to 500 students is about 3 to 4 times the budget I'm asking for. Does that make sense? And the person looked at me and said, that's a very cheeky answer. But I got my money and we were able to continue the work that we were doing. Okay, now that's the challenges at the institutional level. Oh, there are heaps more than that. I'm just trying to summarize, and I'm aware of the time. Okay, at the national level, there are also challenges. Now, Relke mentioned before that I was part of a committee that developed the good practice principles, and the following year we developed the English language standards. Now, these 6 standards, written in 2010, that's quite a while ago, they were actually, despite what people think, they were never included in the higher education standards framework. Let me just remind you what these standards are, and I'll also tell you why they were not included in the higher education standards framework. The government in Canberra was quite happy to include it in the framework, but they consulted with universities, and universities by and large said, no, you can't include these standards in the higher education standards framework. They are far too limiting. They will stop us being able to do what we're trying to do. So the committee got back together again and kind of thought, shall we kind of water them down? And we decided, no, we're not going to water them down because they don't need watering down. They're quite broad as it is. So I'll just remind you what they are. And I've bolded out of the 6 those which I think are the most important one. So the first standard says that the higher education provider ensures that its students are sufficiently proficient in English to participate effectively in their higher education studies on entry. So in other words, find out what the students need when they enter university through whatever means that you're doing it, through assessments in early in their courses, through post-enrollment language assessment, or whatever. I honestly still think today, 10 years later, that this is not very strict, very severe kind of a standard to observe. The second one is slightly less important. The provider ensures that prospective and current students are informed about their responsibilities for further developing their English language proficiency during their higher education studies. Okay, again, nothing very strict here. The third one is that the provider ensures that resourcing for English language development meets student needs throughout their studies. And I think that's where universities balked. They looked at their students, they looked at the retention or attrition rates of their students, and they looked at what would need to be done to change that, particularly if retention or attrition rather was linked to or could be linked to language issues. And they kind of thought, oh no, we would need to fund an academic language learning 3 times the size of what we have. We can't do that. The fourth one is that the provider actively develops students' English language proficiency during their studies. In other words, not just at the beginning, not just inject them with a dose of academic language and learning vaccine at the beginning of their studies. No, that something needs to happen throughout their studies so that they graduate with a relatively good English language proficiency, which is the 5th standard. The provider ensures that students are appropriately proficient in English when they graduate. And that's another one that universities balked at, because some universities, including mine, we did an assessment of final year students to see how fluent, how proficient they were in English. And at my universities, like at many other universities that did that, the news was not always very good. And that's an understatement for the day. The final standard said that the education provider uses evidence from a variety of sources to monitor and improve its support for the development of students' English language proficiency. Okay, so that was not too difficult to achieve. But fortunately, this year, TEXA, the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Agency, a compliance guide has included some of its standards into the most recent document, which is good news, because TEXA, remember, is the agency that accredits higher education providers and or reaccredits existing higher education providers, including universities, of course, but not only universities. There's a whole bunch of higher education providers around the country, at least 25 of them that are not universities or not universities yet. Okay, so let me shift now to something more positive. I hope you survived so far the bad news. Here's the future. As many of you know, I'm a Tintin lover, so that sums it up pretty well. Captain Haddock says, I'm going to try to restart the engines. You go up on the bridge and take the wheel. Here's the engine, as far as I'm concerned. It's not new, but it works well. It's a statement that I wrote in one of the annual reports of the center at UTS back in 2005. I'm going to let you read yourself. I'm not going to read it out to you because it's a whole slide full. It's a statement that I wrote at the time when, this is about 10 years or 9 years after I attended one of the first AALL conferences that was held at Trobe University. That was, here somewhere, where the theme was, that gives you an idea of how embedding is not really new. The theme of that conference in 1994, a conference organized by Kate Shanek, was integrating the teaching of academic discourse into courses in the discipline. And I was quite inspired about what I learned at that conference. So here was my take of that 9 years later. I'll let you read it yourself. Okay, so nothing new here, except that this was written in 2005, nothing new, and many of us are working towards that. Now that, in my opinion, is the only or one of the main ways that we can survive in the work that we are doing. It's also embedding academic language learning in the curriculum is also the most sustainable form of support we can possibly provide. Now, let me talk about strategies to do this at the institutional level. I've got 2 slides of that. First of all, what's needed is to develop an English language proficiency policy. Now, over a third of Australian universities already have one. The other 2/3 also may claim they have one, but most of the time, from my experience, from what I've seen, they're not really English language proficiency policies. They're more policies to govern the entry language requirements for international students. Now, proper English language policy is something quite different. Embedding academic language needs to be supported and endorsed by formal university and faculty policies, procedures, and rules. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. It takes time and so on and so on. What is crucial to make that happen is that you need to have one or several champions at the most senior level at the university. Secondly, second strategy that I like to mention is to review and develop curriculum to embed academic language and learning. Also, very long, takes quite a while to do that, but I mean, that's obviously crucial. This is an increasing trend in Australia. Many universities are doing that at the moment. They're kind of embedding all into some subjects in some courses more than in other places. Embedding academic language needs to be formally integrated in course structures through award subjects over the length of every degree. And I'm referring back to one of the standards I mentioned before, one of the English language standards that I mentioned before. Again, more champions are needed. This time, not so much at the senior level, well, as well as the senior level, but also very much at the local level, the local faculty, department level. You need to get the deans on side, you need to get the associate deans on side, and so on. Implement compulsory post-enrollment language assessment, very important too. Assessing all students' English language proficiency as they start university courses informs the type of developmental and remedial academic language and learning provision needed. I'll talk about the remedial one in a second here. About 2/3 of universities in Australia use some form of post-enrollment language assessment, but it is rarely compulsory. I can think of one example where it's compulsory. It's University of Technology, Sydney, and Caroline Havery and her team are giving a paper tomorrow morning about that, I think, from what I've gathered from the abstract, where it is truly compulsory. Compulsory in the sense that if students do not complete the PLA, the post-enrollment language assessment, there are penalties. That's what I mean by compulsory. Okay, more strategies. Continue to offer supplementary workshops in faculties, even if they are generic. And if they're done in faculties, I call them discipline-flavored workshops. They're still better than generic workshops outside of faculties. So the essay writing 101 becomes essay writing for social science students, for example, or report writing for engineering students, done for engineering students only in their faculty. Because the reason I'm saying that, in addition to embedding academic language and learning curriculum, there will always be students who need more language support than what is provided through the mainstream curriculum. Initiate professional development activities for faculty staff. That's aiming at changing the culture in faculties. The main opposition that's still available, exists in faculties is faculty staff saying, hang on, I was employed as a lecturer of IT, lecturer of medicine, lecturer of engineering, and whatever. It is not my job to teach reading and writing to students. Well, let me tell you, it is your job. If you're going to mark an essay or report, whatever, and you're going to mark it on the basis of content and on form, meaning language, it is your job to do that. But we can help you to do that. Embedding academic language needs to be owned by faculties and supported by ongoing professional development, hopefully or preferably provided by academic language and learning staff. Also, document your work quantitatively and qualitatively. Quantitatively will satisfy the bean counters at your universities. You have to show what you've done so that the budget cuts and whatever next year may not happen as drastically as they've happened over the past 2 years. And you also need to share your work with others. So you need to communicate internally, which is crucial. Spread the good word, liaise externally. And I'll finish on this note, where I'm going to say, join, if you're not already members, join the Association for Academic Language and Learning. All right, it looks like I've managed to stay fairly much on time. This is where I want to end. Here are my references. By the way, the slides will be available after the conference, as I understand. The various papers are being recorded, so that's a good news too. Now over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alex, for your opening keynote. And I think it was a fantastic presentation and really sets the scene for where we go with our discussions and presentations over the next 3 days as well. I was having a look through a lot of the discussions going on in the chat as you were speaking, and I think I share a lot of the sentiments that people were sharing. The shocking figures that you shared about the state of the sector and how it's changed since 2010 paints a really sobering picture. And I think one of the comments that really stuck out for me was how universities have become more inclusive but less equitable over time as well. And I think that's really something for us all to think about moving forward. All right, so we've now got about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So if anybody would like to ask a question using your microphone, feel free to use the raise hand function. Or if you would rather send your question through in the chat, feel free to post it in the chat to me as a direct message, and I can read that out for you. So I guess to get started while people are thinking of their questions, one question I had as you were going through those last couple of slides about the strategies that we can implement to really support students and continue work in the academic language and learning space. So you've got a lot of strategies, but I guess, of course, we know within the institutions we work in, we often have to advocate for ourselves and for our academic language and learning units, and even for embedding these kinds of things into students' coursework as well. Do you have any I guess, ideas on ways that we can better advocate for the work we do in the space and how we can have those conversations within our institutions more broadly?
Oh, there are many, many ways of doing that, and I know what you're talking about, because actually at CDU you had a school of academic language and learning for a long time. That's been restructured out of, it's now something completely different, and you've been, as I said, you've been decentralized in many ways. I was talking to somebody at I can't remember the university. They organize regular forums at the university, kind of mini forums where they invite various people, and they make sure that every dean and every associate dean at university kind of is there, and they have every forum kind of introduced by somebody quite senior at dean level, executive level. And they do that they did that last year, and because of Zoom it was possible. People, it was a nice little break of sitting there doing other work on Zoom. They did that on a regular basis about once a month. So a little symposium where a particular topic was chosen, something quite small, kind of on a definition of embedding, for example, was one example. I think that would be that is quite useful. And then, as I said, finding champions, and particularly champions whose voice is heard further up the hierarchical level, keeping them on side, and basically going and complaining inverted commas to them and saying, look, last year we saw 20 students. Now this year we're seeing 200 students. What's going on here? What can we do to help these students? They need the same help up to 20 students. Can you suggest something? Kind of rhetorical questions. So that there are a number of ways of, it's communication largely. But I realize, Relke, it's not always easy. If your manager is somebody who says, look, I've got enough worries as it is, just do your job. I've got enough work to do with the main part of my job, be it, the library or student services or whatever. That's a challenge in itself. And then to bypass them and go straight to the top is not something that's always very popular at many places, okay? Now, we were lucky at my universities where all of a sudden one of the senior managers at the DVC at the time realized what we were talking about and said, okay, let me see if I can get some strategic funding from the Vice Chancellor. And that's what got the ball rolling, but it still took several years before a full embedded program was taking place. Okay, does that answer your question to some extent?
Thanks, Alex. We've had a question come through in the chat from Steve Campitelli, who asks, it would be a tragedy to see the one-to-one appointments disappear, Alex, as they are so valuable and proven to make a difference. Do you see a day where this may happen? Unfortunately, yes. Now, I totally agree with Steve, and I totally agree with what Kate Channock has been saying for years and years and years. That's one area that's very dear to her heart, or has been very dear to her heart. In my opinion, one-to-ones are extremely valuable, not just because they're a very accurate thermometer of or barometer, or whatever happens in the faculty in a particular course with a particular assignment, so on and so on. But they are extremely important for the student to have that opportunity to talk something through. Now, will universities continue to fund that? I have doubts, because universities realize that it's the most expensive part of the services that we provide, and they find that in fact that studiosity replaces that quite well, as far as they are concerned. They don't explore what the program. Sorry, I shouldn't pick on studiosity, because there are a range of online programs, commercial programs like that that provide that, and they basically say, look, it's much cheaper to have that done commercially outside than to have it done face to face by staff. But I believe they should survive. Whether they will or not, I doubt it. Thanks, Alex. I believe Nicola Rolls had her hand up. Nicola, did you have a question? Maybe not. Or Nicola, if you are speaking, you might be muted because we can't currently hear.
Hi, sorry.
Oh, she's having lunch already. Hi, Nicola.
Hi, Alex. Thank you. That was just a little sobering, but also very very useful to have that sum up of where we're all at in the space. And sad to say, yeah, things don't seem to have got any better since you and I first started having these sort of conversations. But on a positive note, I was hoping you might be able to share with us any examples where universities have actually managed to achieve what you espouse as a really good way forward in terms of, management coming on board and actually practically embedding academic skills across whole curriculums. Are there any examples of where this has
yes, I mean,
worked?
look, the main example, and probably the most important one, and this is not because it's my former university, University of Technology Sydney, but I think what Caroline Havery and her team will talk about tomorrow morning refers to that. I mean, UTS has in fact managed to do what I was advocating here in the strategies I'm suggesting. It's a fully embedded program across all faculties. Students have to attend compulsory subjects, and if they don't, there are penalties. They have to complete a PILA. If they don't, there are penalties and all of that. Not only is that written in their policy and procedures, but it's also written down in the rules. So that's one example. That's probably the most extreme positive, in a positive sense, extreme example I can give. Other universities, I can mention JCU has done an enormous progress in embedding academic language and learning into the curriculum. But unfortunately, I asked that question about a year ago. Unfortunately, universities have also developed something very new, which is to become more secretive. In other words, they don't want to tell other people what they're doing in case somebody else may steal their ideas and so on. And that's something quite new. So they say, yeah, we're doing this and that, but I can't give you more details because I'm not allowed to, type of thing. So there are two universities. Then there is Edith Cowan in Western Australia, has always done a considerable amount of work. And I don't want to kind of give the impression that the other universities don't. It's just that I may not know of what they're doing. But I mean, if other people in the group want to kind of come forward and put their universities in the chat and saying, we're doing the same thing and it's working and so on and so on, I think that would be very great. There we go. Caroline has just said, yeah, the presentation that I'm referring to at UTS is tomorrow morning at 9:20 local time. I encourage many people to go and attend that or listen to it afterwards once it's been recorded. I'm sorry I can't answer your question better than that, Nicolas. But I'm aware that about half a dozen universities are in the process of embedding academic language learning in the curriculum in a variety of ways.
Thanks, Alex.
That's okay.
Good to know it's worked some way.
Great, thanks Alex, thanks Nicola. We've just got another question through in the chat from Eddie, although Eddie then messaged and said he has another question. Would you prefer to ask your questions using the mic, Eddie?
Sure, no problem. Hi Alex, and hi colleagues. Yeah, so I'm also a learning advisor and I'm from USQ in Toowoomba. My question, Alex, is more around the Australian context with the recent changes in higher education reform with the Jobs Ready graduate package, the higher casualization of staff in this space, and accompanied by the increased use of third-party tutoring services. How might we continue to sustain our roles at universities? What are your thoughts? Yeah, so.
I wish I had an answer to that question, Eddie. That's a very hard one. Clearly, if you're not able to do that at university, that's because your university, not that you have not demonstrated that, but university refuses to recognize the value of the work that you do. I wish somehow there was some serious research done in commercial outside provision support that would demonstrate that we're kind of, and here's a research project if somebody wants to go down that track, that would demonstrate in fact that it works to some extent, external commercial services work to some extent, but not as well as what we do at universities. and definitely, and that is something I would swear is the case, would definitely not work as well as a fully embedded academic language provision throughout the curriculum. I mean, that is the way students are going to learn to read and write, is to do that, to learn to do that within their discipline. Now that would be fairly easy to demonstrate, because that is something that external providers do not provide. So maybe going to university, to the bean counters, and senior management, and say, look, this is something that Studiosity does not do. Studiosity does not embed into the curriculum. We can. Let me show you how to do it. I'll go and talk to some colleagues at other universities where they're doing it, and I'll come back and I'll put a proposal to the universities to do that. Sorry, I can't be more specific than that. And I hope that gives you a little bit of optimism.
Thank you, Alex. My question is more, it was, I guess, more around the sector, but, I definitely agree with the point that third-party tutoring services are an adjunct support service,
yes.
And we do not fill the role of what we do. Absolutely, that's a really important point to capture. So.
Great, thanks, Eddie. And we've got another question through in the chat from Tao, who wants to ask whether, Alex, whether the figures take COVID conditions into account. So, for example, did it take into account the drop in international students due to the travel ban?
As I said at the time when I put up the figures, what I do with the figures, I contact universities and say, give me the figures of academic language and learning staff. So they are up to date. They are 2021. In fact, they're very recent. They're about they're still warm. They're still about 2 weeks old. The figures of enrollments and international students, unfortunately, are a little bit older. In other words, what I do there for the sake of consistency, what I've always done for the sake of consistency, is not take the enrollment figures of students and international students from universities, because that's very variable. I go to and it's in the references, the website is there. I go to the Department of Education in Canberra, who report these figures always with 1 year delay. So, and the reason why I do it, as I said, is for consistency's sake. So I'm using the same data across the whole sector. Now, so clearly those figures are 1 year or over a year old, okay? But on the upside of that is that it's consistent across the board. So if there are fewer students now in the Australian higher education sector, that's across the board, not just at one university or the other one. Okay, so I apologize. Well, I don't know why I am apologizing. The figures for last year have not been published yet.
Great, thank you. And I think Debbie just had her hand up. Debbie, did you want to ask a question?
Hello, Debbie. Where are you?
Hi, Alex. I'm here, but I can't enable my video. So, Alex, I just wanted to add to what Eddie and that conversation you were having with Eddie. Eddie's in my team at USQ, and Eddie has actually led a study that we have done around the use of smart thinking. We don't use Studiosity at all. Another story. But what I wanted to say was how important that contextualizing that you were referring to is. That while smart thinking can bring about particular results with students, what it cannot ever replace is that contextualization. Hence Eddie's comment about, I think, the adjunct nature of the learning advisor running alongside of what is happening and how critical that is to our work. And I would suggest, in line with one of the comments you made before about advocating, that this is a very important point for us to be out there actively advocating, particularly when we're in this situation. I find some conflict here, and that is we're being told over here to be mindful of the students' individual circumstances, to be mindful of their personal circumstances, all that student advising stuff. And then over here, we're being told, actually, we're going to systemize all of this. We're not going to have, too much of that personal because it takes too much time and money. But I think we need to be advocating for the bit in between. And that is, we've actually got to maintain contact with students in a contextual way. Thank you for your presentation, Alex. Always
Absolutely.
enjoyable.
You're welcome. Yeah, look, I totally agree with you, Debbie. I mean, there's no, look, I mean, some people think that I'm against studiosity. No, it plays a role. It's a supplementary provision, but unfortunately, some universities have literally replaced our services and our staff with studiosity. So that's all the students can use. It's great. I mean, 3 o'clock in the morning, you wanted to have your essay checked, you can have it checked at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's a service that we do not, fortunately, that we do not provide at this stage. But so to use it as a supplement, fine. It's better than nothing. It's not cheap. Okay.
No.
Lovely to talk to you, Debbie, as usual.
Thanks, Debbie and Alex. And I think we've got time for one last question. So we've got a question from Victoria in the chat. So she says, thanks, Alex, about sharing their work and how we do it. It's often heard about the preference by managers for stats to show the impact of our work. Is it really still the case? Or is it perhaps something that we should question? Are universities so closed to qualitative studies?
Did you say close to qualitative?
Yeah.
No, I meant, are they not, sorry, can I say, I meant to say, are they really so unaccepting of qualitative studies? Because there is this perception that you must provide stats and quantitative. And of course, in my experience, it takes a lot of work to get that sort of data.
It varies from university to university, Victoria. I must say, I'm very much in favour of qualitative studies, but the bean counters want to link that qualitative study to quantitative study. They want to know that our retention rate last year was X% and it has improved by 10% as a result of you guys employing 2 more academic language and learning people in your center, okay? To make a causal effect from the work we do to the retention rate improvement is almost impossible. But if you can make a correlational link, that's very important, okay? So I would not suggest to replace qualitative study by quantitative one. Both play a role. There will be people that, you know, and yeah, in the days when I don't know what's happening at UTS at the moment in that space, you know, but at the time when I was trying to advocate what I talked about today, I definitely used both, right? Because some people, like our vice chancellor at the time, he did not read anything that was more 2 pages long, and he preferred tables and graphs. All right, so I had to feed him what he wanted, what he wanted to see. And other people said, you know, I mean, how do you qualify the work that you do? All right, so I gave them then success, you know, feedback from students, comments from people in faculties, and all the stuff that you can gather from to supplement to prepare your quantitative data. Your qualitative data. Both are important.
Thank you.
Okay, pleasure.
Wonderful. All right, it's 11:30, so we better leave things there. If you could all join me once again in thanking Alex for his excellent keynote presentation to kick off our conference and our ideas and thinkings for the next 3 days. Thank you so much, Alex. We now have a 10-minute break before the first round of concurrent sessions begin at 10:40 a.m. Darwin time. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.